Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. And this is for our class for Wednesday, December 10th, where we are continuing forward with poetry. In fact, next week we will finish our poetry section and we will also finish the semester and we will have our final examination. And what I will be doing with our final examination is giving you 24 hours in which to respond to it. If it was a face-to-face class, then you would have the class period to respond. Series of essay questions, and you get to choose. The bulk of the exam, 80 points, will be devoted to poetry because you will not have had a chance to write a paper about poetry. And Wednesday, the last day of class, is the last day that you could hand in any outstanding assignments. So if you owe me a revision for paper number 1 or you owe me paper number 2, that would be the last day in which you could hand it in. And since you have 24 hours for your exam, I will post the exam at the time our class would normally meet at 10 a.m. on Wednesday of next week. And you have 24 hours in which to submit in that exam to me. So that would be by Thursday at 10 a.m. And in terms of where we are talking about Emily Dickinson, who is so iconic, particularly in this area. And I had suggested that you might want to see the Emily Dickinson documentary. And once again, in the notes below, I've got the link for you. It's approximately an hour long, so it's a bit long and a bit dated because it's from 1978. Or I'm sorry, 1987. But it gives all kinds of references to her poetry, so you get a nice overview of her writing. And it also talks a little bit about her unconventional lifestyle. And one of the things that I think is illustrated in her poetry is that her unconventional writing reflects her unconventional lifestyle, and vice versa. And it was a crime what happened after she died and her poems were published. She wrote them for herself, not to be published. And editors changed the poetry around to basically, quote, correct them, unquote, to make them follow the standard rules of grammar and punctuation, which you would never do with a poem, or you should never do with a poem. So whenever you're reading Emily Dickinson's poetry, you want to make sure that you're reading the original poetry that she wrote and not the poetry that was edited by editors. Actually, wasn't until about the 1950s or so that a complete edition of her poetry, in the way she intended it to be written, was released. It's called the Johnson edition. That gives a whole different sense to her poetry. It's much more raw, it's much more jagged, it's much more unconventional, much again in the way that she lived her life, being a spinster, not marrying despite the expectations of her social class, not going to church, again, defying the expectations of her social class, not having children, being very vocal about disliking housework, everything that would seem to fly in the face of what was considered to be appropriate for a woman of her position. And instead, she spent her time in her father's house. She did have a certain level of affluence and privilege that allowed her to do so, writing poems, over 1,000 poems, closer to 2,000 poems. And her poetry is not easy to understand, oftentimes because she wrote it for herself, not necessarily to be published. And even the scholars themselves will argue that her poetry is challenging. So I've always suggested that when you're reading Emily Dickinson's poetry, that you don't necessarily put the pressure on yourself to understand every single word. Even the scholars can't do that. And some poems are more complex than others. The poem that I had selected for us to talk about, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, I think is a fairly straightforward poem. Now, she did not title any of her poems, so we refer to her poetry by the first line, much like we do with Shakespeare's sonnets, because he didn't title his poetry. Or we refer to the poem by the number, because scholars have tried to organize them in some numerical order. And the link that I provided you with for Emily Dickinson's poetry is the Poetry Foundation, which is a great link because you can trust the correctness of the poetry that is posted there. If you want a quick and easy way to determine whether or not you are reading Emily Dickinson's original poetry, look for the dashes. At the ending of lines in her poem, she was very fond of using dashes instead of commas. And Of course, editors would have changed those dashes, which are long pauses, into commas, which are shorter pauses. But it completely changes the meaning. And those long pauses, in some respects, kind of mimic the structure of a church hymnal, which makes Emily Dickinson, again, um, rather unique in that she would be using a religious structure, even though she was not a supporter of religion. And again, it just shows one of the many ways in which she defined conventions during her time period. And the poem Because I Could Not Stop for Death is about one of her favorite themes. She oftentimes talks about universal themes, so even though her poetry is quite personal, most people can find a way to connect to themes of love or loneliness, and in this particular instance, death. She oftentimes would write about death in her poetry. Some people say that because of that, her poetry is rather dark. I disagree. She oftentimes would write about death in a very positive, reassuring way, as if she knew better than anybody as to how it felt to be dead. She oftentimes writes from the perspective of the afterlife, which is exactly what she did here in this particular poem when she says, Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. And of course, portraying death as kind, that in and of itself is unusual when we think about the way that most people think of death. And of course, the idea is that we can't stop for death because death makes the decision about when to take us. We're not supposed to make the decision about when to go to death. So the idea that we are not in control in that particular instance. And the carriage held, but just ourselves. And immortality. And this is one of the reasons why death is portrayed as a positive, because death offers immortality. So while Emily Dickinson didn't necessarily believe in organized religion, she did believe in spirituality. She thought that God could be evidenced in the world around us, in effect. And this poem is evidence of an afterlife and a God, as she talks about the journey that she took when death, and death is personified with a capital D, comes to basically take her to the afterlife. And she talks about being in a carriage. There's a long literary tradition here about life as a journey, a kind of carriage ride, if you will. If you wanted to think about something like Oedipus the King, when he was in a carriage and he was at a literal and figurative crossroads. And of course, when she's talking about death, we see how she's talking about leaving the earthly realm and going into the spiritual realm. And we see her leave behind many of the earthly concerns that we oftentimes are preoccupied with. Things like time. Time doesn't exist in eternity because you've got basically everlasting time. Time is just a concern in our world because ultimately it's something that is limited. So when she says that he slowly drove and he knew no haste, of course, because it's not necessary for any kind of haste or concern about time in the afterworld. And she had put away her labor and her leisure too, and labor and leisure are also human constructs, which are not part of the afterlife. For his civility, so death is presented as both kind and civil. And in the third stanza, again, a stanza being organized much like a paragraph, it's a section of text that usually talks about one topic. We see how they passed in the carriage the school where children strove, so this is supposed to represent childhood or youth. At recess in the ring, in childhood you play, and in ring around the rosy, the pocket full of posy, which is actually a child's game that's about plague, which is quite appropriate considering the subject matter of this poem. And then the fields of gazing grain. And again, if we think about the time period of this poem in the 1800s, this is how many people, adults, earn their living, basically farming. And gazing grain is supposed to represent our adulthood when we work. So the setting sun, and this is supposed to represent old age, the beginning of descent. Or rather, he passed us, and the dews drew quivering and chill. So they're getting farther and farther away from the earthly realm and moving into the spiritual realm, where now we're moving from the daytime to the nighttime, and the weather is shifting as well. The dews are quivering and chill, but her gown is made only of gossamer, very thin fabric, oftentimes associated with fairies. My tippet, which is a shawl, only tulle, again, another thin fabric that's used for things like tutus and wedding veils. But again, she wouldn't need to be wearing clothing to protect against the elements because that also is a human concern. Nothing to be considered about in an afterlife. So clothing, too, is irrelevant. We passed before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. House is capitalized. She oftentimes capitalizes her nouns. This house, we can speculate, perhaps it is the house of God, church, or perhaps it's her crypt. Perhaps it's her literal home that they're passing by. There is a long tradition of taking past or taking those that have passed past their homestead before they are buried. Regardless, this house is so far away it seemed like a swelling of the ground. And the roof, it was barely visible, that's how far away it is. And the cornice, which is an architectural element of a roof, it looked like it was in the ground. So again, they're leaving all of this behind. So when we get our final stanza, this is the most important one. Since then, 'tis centuries and yet feels shorter than the day. In other words, she's speaking from the perspective of the afterlife. All of this happened many, many years ago. And of course, because there is no time, there really is no way to measure the length of it because eternity is that, eternal. Where I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity, and obviously the horses' heads are the horses that are pulling the carriage. But this is also a biblical reference for the horsemen of the apocalypse. We're talking about Armageddon, so this isn't just the ending of her life. This would be in reference to the ending of all lives from the biblical tradition. And again, while she wasn't necessarily religious, she would oftentimes use biblical references or even the structures of biblical songs or church hymnals. However, she would use them in ways that were quite surprising and in many ways would fly in the face of the expectations of society. But she lived her life in that way as well. So I gave that poem as an example of the 1800s, and we move forward to an example of a poem from the 1900s, where we are talking about a very well-known poem that you might have heard of before, Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. And might I suggest that it is perhaps the second most misread poem on the face of the planet. The first being Shakespeare's sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, where people misread that poem and say that it's a love poem written to a woman, which it's not. There's never any reference to gender, and it's less about love in the romantic sense and more about an appreciation of beauty. It's a poem of flattery. And if the scholars are correct, and there's no reason to think they're not, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day was written to a young man, probably Shakespeare's patron, such as the Earl of Southampton. And that it's not a poem with homoerotic tendencies. It's more a poem of celebrating beauty and also offering flattery to somebody who has political and economic power. And Shakespeare was nothing but a wise businessman in that respect. In terms of The Road Not Taken, very common poem, so much so that it was even quoted in Dead Poets Society. Two roads diverge, I took the one less traveled by. That's made all the difference. And this poem is usually read as a treatise on the importance of defying convention and expectation. But that's not really what the poem says. Because if we were to read it carefully, and yes, we're told there are two roads that diverge in a wood, and we've talked about the woods before, represents the untamed, the wild. And the yellow wood, I can't help but think of the autumn, a time of season and change, especially in New England, with Frost being a New England poet. But these roads are supposed to be symbolic, they're metaphorical, representative of two choices. That you've got two choices, and sorry it could not travel both. The situation of wouldn't it be nice if we could have both at the same time. And long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it been in the undergrowth. And the very common situation of trying to see the future, what might happen if we chose one path as opposed to another path. literally and figuratively. And notice how he equivocates through this poem, because in the second stanza he says that both roads look pretty much just as fair. They look equal in effect. And that the passing there really was about the same, or at least at that moment. The idea of a choice that's so similar that you could go back and forth between determining is one really better than another. Because in the third stanza, it very clearly says that that morning, at that moment, they both equally lay. And how he had hoped that perhaps he could take a road or a choice and then go back and take the other road or choice. But of course, things continually change. So that's an impossibility to go back to the original choice, because all of the variables will be different at that point. And then we hear, I shall be telling this with a sigh. And there are lots of reasons why someone could be sighing. It could be positive, a sigh of happiness or relief or contentment. Or it could be negative, a sigh of disappointment or frustration or even anger. The idea is that this is an important enough choice that it would warrant to talk about it years after the fact, ages and ages hence. Two roads diverging a wood, and notice the repetition of I took the one less traveled by, that this was the right choice for him. Not necessarily saying that this is the right choice for everyone. And that has made all the difference. And again, the assumption is that the difference is positive, but it's not quite that simple. It could also be negative. And when we think about Dead Poets Society, it's also much more complex than what it appears to be on the surface. It's more than just carpe diem, seize the day. It's not about being reckless because you need to live in the moment. It's about, yes, staying convicted with your own individuality, staying connected with your own individuality and maintaining your convictions, but not to be foolhardy, not to call God or to make a decision that ultimately will mean the ending of your life. So the movie has a certain level of complexity to it, and this poem has a certain level of complexity to it, because if nothing else, look at the title. The title of the poem is The Road Not Taken, the choice not made, not the road taken or the choice made. And this is about the very human experience of making a choice and wondering what if. If I had chosen the other road, the other path, what could have happened? Would it have been better, worse, different? One of the reasons why I assign this poem is because there is an example of an explication at the ending of the poem. Explication sounds like explanation. They're very similar. They're basically, you go through a shorter piece of writing, usually poetry, line by line, word by word, piece of punctuation by piece of punctuation, to try to determine meaning. And I wanted just to read you this explication of The Road Not Taken, because it could give you a good example of how you could respond to a final exam question. Now, that said, I don't expect anything as neat or as developed or as polished as this. This is more like what you would construct if you were writing a paper and you had a couple of weeks. But at the very least, for the final exam, you should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, an introduction, a body, and conclusion. So this example that I'm going to read to you has definitely an introduction, and it's got multiple body paragraphs. Again, I'm not necessarily expecting that for the final, and a concluding paragraph. And it reads, the poem The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost intrigues readers because it is at once so simple and so deeply resonant. Recalling a walk in the woods, the speaker describes how he came upon a fork in the road, which forced him to choose one path over another. Though, quote, sorry, unquote, that he could not travel both, he made a choice after carefully weighing his two options. This essentially is what happens in the poem. There is no other action. And this incident is charged with symbolism, significance by the speaker's reflection on the necessity and consequences of his decision. Good opening paragraph. And now we get into our body paragraphs, which read, the final stanza indicates that the choice concerns more than simply walking down a road, for the speaker says the chosen path has affected his entire life. And that, quote, made all the difference, unquote. Frost draws on a familiar enough metaphor when he compares life to a journey. But he's also calling attention to a less commonly noted problem. Despite our expectations, aspirations, appetites, hopes, and desires, we can't have it all. Making one choice precludes another. It's impossible to determine what particular decision the speaker refers to. Perhaps he had to choose a college, a career, a spouse. Perhaps he was confronted with two mutually exclusive ideas, beliefs, or values. There's no way to know, because Frost wisely creates a symbolic choice and implicitly invites us to supply our own circumstances. So that was the first body paragraph. And notice that they didn't go in chronological order here. They basically began with the ending of the poem. So let me read you the second body paragraph, a second piece of evidence in this argument about the poem. The speaker's reflections about his choice are essential to an understanding of the poem as the choice itself. Indeed, they may be more central. He describes the road taken as, quote, having perhaps the better claim, / because it was grassy and wanted wear, unquote. He prefers the, quote, less traveled, unquote, path. That seems to be an expression of individualism, which would account for the differences choice made in his life. Frost complicates the matter, however, by having the speaker also acknowledge that there was no significant difference between the two roads. One was just as fair, and the other was, quote, worn really about the same, unquote. And, quote, both that morning equally lay, / in leaves no strep had trodden black, unquote. Notice how in this body paragraph, what we've got is a good amount of quoting, sections from the poem, not the entire poem, but enough sections to help support our argument. And sometimes when I was reading the poem, the quotation, I would say /. So if you ever see a / in a quote, what that means is that is a line break in poetry. So what you are doing when you are quoting a poem is that you are showing the ending of one line and the beginning of next line by putting a / there. The next body paragraph continues. The speaker imagines that in the future, ages and ages hence, he will recount his choice with a sigh that will satisfactorily explain the course of his life. But Frost seems to be having a little fun here by showing us how the speaker will embellish his past decision to make it appear more dramatic. What we hear is someone trying to convince himself that the choice he made significantly changed his life. When he recalls what happened in the, quote, yellow wood, unquote, a color that gives a glow to the irretrievable moment when his life seemed to be on the verge of a momentous change, he appears more concerned with the path he did not choose than with the path he took. Frost shrewdly titles the poem to suggest the speaker's sense of loss and not being able to travel both roads. When the speaker's reflections about his choice are examined, the poem reveals his nostalgia instead of affirming to his decision to travel a self-reliant path in life. And now there's yet another body paragraph. The rhyme stanzas of the road not taken follow a pattern established in the first 5 lines, A, B, A, A, B. This rhyme scheme reflects, perhaps, the speaker's efforts to shape his life into a pleasing and coherent form. The natural speech rhythms Frost uses allow him to integrate the rhythms unobtrusively. But there's a slight shift in lines 19 through 20 when the speaker asserts self-consciously that the, quote, less traveled road, unquote, which we already know to be basically the same as the other road, made all the difference. Unlike all the other rhymes in the poem, difference does not rhyme precisely with hence. The emphasis must be placed on difference to make it rhyme perfectly with hence. And that might suggest that the speaker is trying a little too hard to pattern his life on his earlier choice in the woods. So this paragraph talks about the scanning of the poem, which we had discussed, that you could go through a poem and identify things like the rhyme scheme or pattern, or you could determine the beat or the meter, much like you could go through a sentence and diagram it and identify parts of speech. But if you're going to do that, then you need to talk about how and why that might be important to our understanding the argument. In this instance, the writer who is examining this poem talks about a particular pattern and rhyme and suggests, and notice because this is a bit of a stretch in the argument that we've got qualifiers there, such as perhaps, suggesting that, for instance, this perhaps might mean or could mean. And finally, we have a concluding paragraph. Perhaps the best way to begin reading Frost's poetry is to accept the invitation he placed at the beginning of many volumes of his poems. The pasture means what it says, of course. It's about taking care of some farm chores. But it's also a means of saying one thing in terms of another. So, which is a nice concluding paragraph because it basically doesn't give us any new information, gives us a sense of closure. And this is just one example of many examples that we could read of how one could examine a poem. But I thought this would be a good model for you. And also, since this poem is so iconic and is so oftentimes misunderstood, that it's not so much about individuality, but more about the regret or even longing about the choice that you did not make. Think about how that might apply to Dead Poets Society as well. And in the poetry final examination, you'll have the option of writing about the poems we've read or Dead Poets Society because this is a film class. You just don't know which questions I'm going to be asking in terms of poetry, but all of those are valid. And it is an open book, open note exam so that you can utilize outside resources. Again, you really shouldn't be spending more than 2 hours or so on the exam, which is what you would be spending in an in-class situation. But you have 24 hours in which to finish that examination. So, another poem that I have that's representative of the 1900s, which is very different than the kind of poetry that we've been reading thus far, is a poem entitled America by Allen Ginsberg. You can probably tell from the title that the poem is going to be about, well, America. And Allen Ginsberg and many like him in the 1950s and 1960s identified themselves as beat poets, where basically they used a stream of consciousness form. They tried to mimic thought patterns to critique society and societal injustice, and oftentimes to utilize poetry that would fly in the face of the conventional forms that we are or were accustomed to prior to their time, the Shakespearean sonnets or the romantic sick rose approaches to poetry, or even something like an Emily Dickinson or a Robert Frost. So the poetry is raw, it's ugly, and some people love it because they call it a poetry of reality. Some people hate it because they talk about that it's self-indulgent and offensive. And I wanted you to listen to the poetry because we'll talk about it next class. I have two versions of his poem. It's a long poem, America. The first version takes him 8 minutes to read, and he read a draft of the poem, not the final version. So there will be differences between this initial reading that I'm going to have you listen to and what ultimately appears in its final form. He's reading in front of a live audience in Berkeley, California, which was known as a place for progressive movements. Ginsberg himself was an English professor at Berkeley. So when he makes references to the idea that he could never teach for a living, there is sarcasm involved with that. And I wanted you to hear this, not just so that you could hear the draft, but so that you could hear the audience's response. And as you can tell very quickly, the audience was quite delighted by it. The next reading of the poem is approximately 5 minutes, so it's shorter because we don't have the audience members interrupting for things like applause and so forth. And it's a studio reading of the actual final version of the poem. They're both very different. So if you can listen to both of those, we'll talk about that next class, as well as finish up our poetry section. I have a poem by Martina Espada entitled Coca-Cola and Coco Frio. And finally, a poem by Amanda Gorman, The Hill We Climb. And that would pretty much put closure onto our class before our final examination. So, as you know, because I didn't quite get through all of the poetry that I had hoped to in our last class, I am using the same attendance question for last class and for this class. And it's basically asking you of the 4 poems that we initially discussed in class, which one was your favorite and why. Obviously, no right or wrong answer here, but it's a question of you're defending your particular position. Certainly, you don't have to respond to your peers, but I encourage it. But you do have to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. So next class, as I indicated, we'll finish the poetry section, and I'll leave you to listen to 2 versions of America, which you can find in the notes below. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.